All right, Sarvesh, before I start, just give me a thumbs up if my audio is fine.
Yes, sir. Your audio is clear.
Okay, super. Thank you. Thank you, Sarvesh. A very good evening to all our viewers. I hope all of you and your family members are doing safe and healthy. Now we are almost an year in this unprecedented pandemic, and as the history is replete with examples of human resilience against all odds, we will continue to put a strong fight against this disruptive situation too. In any case, it is still not the time to let your guards down or throw caution to the wind. So please do take all necessary precautions to ensure your safety, good health, and safety of your loved ones too. With that, welcome to yet another session on Master Speak. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us today. Please tell us which city or town you are logged in from. It is always interesting to know different places that our viewers join us from. So please do let us know in the comment box. Do tag your colleagues or friends or anyone you would like to join us for this session. It's always fun to learn together. So please don't forget to tag your friends and get them to join this session and be a part of the learning experience. And as always, do not forget to keep posting your comments and questions. Remember, the two lucky questions will be rewarded with Amazon gift voucher at the end of the show, but you will have to stay till the end of the show and keep asking us questions. So today we will take the conversation on leadership forward to discuss how leaders need to operate in a very different context that we have seen getting created as a result of this pandemic. As we try to bring our lives back to normalcy, we must acknowledge that the world around us is changing rapidly too. And one thing that will never be the same as before is our workplace. So, we will talk about how leaders today will need to lead from anywhere. I am happy to introduce our master speaker for today, David Burkus. David is a TEDx speaker, he's a psychologist, and he's the associate professor of leadership and innovation at Oral Roberts University, where he was recently named one of the nation's top 40 under 40 professors who inspire. He is the author of four books and has delivered keynote speeches and workshops for Fortune 500 companies, including Microsoft and Google. And since 2017, he's been ranked as one of the world's top business thought leaders by Thinkers 50. David lives outside of Tulsa with his wife and their two boys. So, David, while we will share notes on life about life with two boys another time, because I have two boys of my own, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a
Oh,
pleasure to
thank you.
have you on this show. We are
Thank
all
you.
ears to hear your perspective.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I think we could commiserate over the two boys thing, especially
Yes.
since in the early part of 2020, I was also the principal of what I called Burke Academy because we were responsible for schooling them as well as the public schools were closed. So that was an interesting time.
That must be a toughest job to do.
Yeah, it was, I figured I was a professor, so I'm an educator, so I got this, right? But college students and 8-year-olds are two very different types of students.
Yes. Well, thank you, David. We are all ears to hear about what you have to share with us, and of course, the book. Congratulations for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a small piece. It's an attempted contribution to where I think we're headed, which is this what I call a work from anywhere world. The big question in 2020 is when are we all coming back to the office? And those of us that have been paying attention realize we're not. We're not all coming back, at least not all at once and all of the time. You don't send millions and millions of people to work from home and then expect them to come back to a normal routine. They've built their life a little bit differently. They like it that way. And so leaders are going to need to figure out, how do you lead teams that are half on location and half remote, what I call that are working from anywhere? How do you lead from anywhere?
Super. So, David, Sarvesh, we can have David on the screen. So, please go ahead, David.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, precisely. This is where we're headed. In the early days of 2020, I think a lot of us in leadership figured that the change in our workplace, that the move to working remotely was a temporary thing. Here in the United States, where I am, we had this phrase 15 days to slow the spread. But then around day 11, it switched to 30 days to slow the spread. And I'm pretty sure we're on day 315 at this point to slow the spread. There's a lot of people, millions of people still working from home, millions of leaders still leading remotely. And I think when we were at 15 days, when we thought it was temporary, it was easy to say, let's just get through this. Let's just figure out a way to sort of survive temporarily. Then we'll all come back and we'll go back to normal. But as that stretched on, we had to start learning new skills. And the skills that we've learned over the last year, if we've learned them, the skills that we've learned over the last year or so are the ones that we're going to need to carry us forward into the future, because what we've been experimenting with, what I call the great work from home experiment, is actually a preview of the future that we're headed for. I've been studying organizations that bring out the best in their people and leaders that bring out the best in their people for decades now. And one of the things I find most interesting is that whenever you lead from a place of trust and giving your people autonomy, you end up with a much more flexible workplace anyway. You end up with a leading from anywhere workplace anyway. When you hold people accountable to outcomes and not just judge their activity or their presence, you end up with a much more flexible workforce. But a lot of leaders are still struggling to figure that out. And the number one question and the answer that I wanted to give you today to that question, the number one question I get when it comes to thinking about how we lead in this remote world, or in this world where some people are co-located and others are remote, the big question I get is actually around culture. It's around what makes a thriving team culture. What makes people on a team that is scattered across the country or scattered across the globe feel like they're a part of one unified team? And so that's the question I'd like to focus in on and give you some practical ways that you can make your team, however remote or co-located it is, feel like that thriving team that clicked the way it did when you were working together in the same place. And when we look at the research on this, and some of this research was conducted what I call BC, before Corona. A lot of this research was conducted on virtual teams, global teams in organizations where the majority of employees were co-located, and sought to figure out what is the difference between thriving remote teams and teams that fall apart. And what they found was that two elements that leaders focused in on in the early days, and if you haven't focused in on these yet, there's no time like the present, but two elements of that team that leaders focused in on really drove results in terms of whether or not that team collaborated and worked together, whether or not we got the benefits of actual teamwork, or whether the leader just felt like he or she was managing a dozen individual relationships. Those three elements, were shared understanding, shared identity, and psychological safety. And I'll cover each in turn. Shared understanding, shared identity, and psychological safety. And I'll give you some practical tips you can do to begin to build those on your team, even today or tomorrow, whenever you want to implement them. So let's define some terms first. Shared understanding is the extent to which members of the team have a commonly held perspective on the team's expertise, assigned tasks, the context they're working in, their work preferences. I call this shared understanding is how well the team knows who knows what and how to ask them for that information. It means, do we understand how our coworkers prefer to work? Do we understand what their real skills and expertise are? And most importantly, in the last few months, do we understand how they're working and how they prefer to work? Here in the United States, when the great work from home experiment began, it became pretty obvious pretty early on that a lot of people were working in different contexts. I'm lucky enough to be broadcasting with you today from about a 10 by 10 room in the basement of my house with a high-speed wired internet connection going through it so that I can get you the fastest connection possible. That's great. Other people on my team and other people on a variety of teams, when they were sent to work from home, maybe they bought a folding screen and they put it in the dining room in the corner to create a little cubicle in the corner of their dining room, or in a spare bedroom, or at the same table that their children were trying to do school from. And they're working on an older laptop and they're working on a Wi-Fi connection that's not as powerful. Everyone's working in a different context, partly because of the way we had to just rush to flip from an in-person environment to a home environment, but also because of the way everybody's lives work. And when you understand that context, you begin to have different expectations for people. You know, I expect a little bit less responsiveness from the person who's working from their laptop at the same table that their kids are going to school with. And that's okay, especially if I know that person will get me results. But just taking the time to understand that goes a huge way into helping build that sense of team. In the same way, it's worth having this shared understanding conversation because we need to know how to ask for help and how to make requests for help from other people and how to raise our hand and say, I need help on something. When we were all working co-located, this was easy, right? We all worked in and around each other. And so even if we went to our manager, even if somebody came to us as leaders and asked us for help, we knew who to point them to. And that person just happened to be in the room because we were all working from the same spot. Well, now it's a little bit different. And what happens for a lot of teams is they end up making requests for help just from the team leader. And then the team leader often just gives them the best help they can provide, even knowing that there's someone else on the team who can provide better help. So if I'm engaged in this shared understanding, I'm really helping people understand the knowledge, skills, abilities, and expertise of everyone on their team. And then also bringing that team together to talk about how we're going to make requests for help. How are we going to keep each other updated on what we're working on? How are we going to solicit help? How are we going to give feedback to our teammates? All of these things are things that we could kind of smooth over when we were co-located because we were all together and it happened organically. And a lot of leaders went into the great work from home experiment and our future of work from anywhere without a plan to build the norms for how we're going to do all those things. And shared understanding speaks to that. So how do we build shared understanding in a team? Here's a couple ideas for how you can get started, things you can implement tomorrow or this week to help your team get started. The first is what I call virtual tours. And this is, if you haven't already had the time to do it, this is just taking the time in a meeting to have people, a virtual meeting, to have people explain the context they're working in. This means I grab this web camera right here and I move it around the office to show you the context that I'm working in. And like I said, I'm one of the lucky ones, but you might learn a couple things about the context I work in. You may learn a couple things from looking at all of the crazy artifacts on my shelves. You might learn something about me. You might notice the little red do not disturb tab that I hang on my door to signal to my children that Daddy's giving a webinar right now. You can't just come in and ask me for the Wi-Fi password. You might learn all sorts of things if you take the time to understand the context that I'm working in. And a virtual tour speaks to that. You could do this, quick 30 seconds for everyone on your team, or you could start every meeting with one person sharing the context that they're working in and how they've stayed productive during this whole time, so that we're not only understanding the context, we're also getting best practices. The next thing you could do is you could partner people, especially those extroverts who have been really suffering over the last 9 months from a lack of peer interaction. You could partner them together for what we call work sprints. Now, this isn't a meeting. What a work sprint is I meet up in a virtual call, so Zoom call, Microsoft Teams, some video call with a colleague, and we exchange a few pleasantries. Hi, how are you doing? Talk about the day, but then we get to work, solo work. We just know that the other person is there. This is similar to how, if we went to university, how we would often have group studies where we would go out together or go to the library and sit 4 people across the table and not really talk all that often, but work around each other. Work sprints do that because it makes it more likely that when you're working on something and you need help, you at least ask that person instead of typing out an email to the individual leader. And we get the team used to interacting with each other the way they used to do when we were co-located. So work sprints speaks to that. It's also, I've learned over time as I've tried to put into practice what I found from my research, it's also a great way to stay productive because I found that if you're struggling to balance family and work life, it's hard to find time to go off and work on a project solo when your family's around you and needs you. But if they know you have a call that you have to be on, they leave you alone. So the idea of a call just so that you can work on that thing you would work on individually can actually keep you incredibly productive. And the last thing I'll say around shared understanding is the idea of holding office hours. This is something you as a leader need to be doing right now, but also something you want to be encouraging your people to do. Office hours just means there's a dedicated block of time on the calendar. Maybe it's every Wednesday afternoon. Maybe it's every Thursday morning. It doesn't matter when it is, but it's a time that I'm available for spur of the moment questions, for quick appointments. It's not time that has to be scheduled. It's time that you can call my phone or the time that I'm actually just open on a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams call and anybody can drop in, but it's time that I've set aside to be responsive to you. It's sort of the virtual version of the open door policy that we used to encourage a lot of leaders to have in a co-located environment. I was a full-time business school professor for 10 years. I'm still part-time now. And office hours are one of the most useful meetings I have on a regular basis, because a student will come in with one question, and inevitably what happens? We end up talking about a lot of different things. We end up talking about the bigger question behind that question. We talk about their hopes, their career goals, etc. And in a company, the same thing happens. When people come in for a 2 to 3 minute question, what ends up happening is a 10 to 15 minute conversation that bonds you two together much more. And so as a leader, office hours is something you need to be open for right now. You can decide how you schedule them. It can be being on the Zoom call waiting for people to come in. It can be, here's a block of time that I'm deliberately keeping open for people to call my cell phone, or even just send me text messages, whatever it is. But it needs to be a time that you announce to your people right away. And then a few weeks later, as it's working, and as you figure out what works best for your team, maybe encourage a couple other people on your team to hold office hours as well. So virtual tours, work sprints, office hours are how we build that sense of shared understanding. Let's flip that and let's talk about the next element, which is shared identity. How do we build a sense of shared identity? Now let's define the term first. Shared identity is the extent to which team members feel the same sense of who they are as a designated group. What do I mean by that? It means how well does the team feel like a team? And in a co-located environment, this was easier, right? Because we're all working together. But if shared understanding was the problem many leaders needed to solve in 2020, shared identity is the problem many leaders will need to solve in 2021. Because as people come back to the office, not all of them will come back at the same time, and most of them will not want to be there for the same length of time as they were before. So there's going to be a real balance between who's in the office right now and who's working remotely more often. And there'll be a tendency for us versus them to creep in, with us being the people who are at the office more often and them being the remoters, or in some very rare cases, us being the ones who work remotely and them being the ones that are co-located. And you don't want that. You want your team feeling like a team. You want the people who are working together on a project to know that this is the group that I bring my identity to. This is the group that I hold myself accountable to. This is the group that helps me work and I help them work. That's what shared identity speaks to. And it's going to be a big challenge as we move forward in this work from anywhere world, because it used to be easy to create a sense of team when you were all together. Even the act of working together was the act of bonding together. And so leaders need to be looking at ways that they can increase shared identity on their team from wherever they are. And here's a couple ideas for you on how to do that. So a couple different ways that you can build a shared identity on your team. The first one, I love this, is called, I call it fika. Fika is a Swedish word for coffee, because in the Swedish tradition, the act of going to get coffee with someone else is sort of the most bonding experience you can do. It's the act of pulling away from work, taking a break from work, but it's not seen as slacking off from work. It's not seen as doing less work. It's seen as a vital part of it, because we know that breaks and time away from work makes work better. But it's also a time that we're bonding with our colleague or with our friend that we haven't spoken to in a while, or with a distant person in the industry. Fika speaks to that. And a lot of fully distributed companies that I've studied, companies with over 1,000 people all employed without any sort of headquarters, take the time to bring their people into digital fikas, meaning that every once in a while they have a 30-minute chat over a video call where they take a coffee break together. And they talk about whatever they want, as long as it's a non-work topic. The idea here is that we're looking to build bonds, not looking to coordinate work. We're looking to let people take a break so they can come back to work better. Now, people will inevitably sneak a couple work questions in, and that's okay. But what you want is you want people to get comfortable being around each other in a break format as well. The same way that certain groups of people would go on lunch breaks together or eat together during the day at work, or just spend or take a walk together. Those sort of things, we're looking to digitally rebuild those in what I call fika. Now, the next thing you can do, which sort of speaks to fika, is planning shared meals. We know from decades of research and also from millennia of human history that people bond over shared meals and breaking bread together. I live in the United States, where people who have shared meals are often having, very individual plated, everyone orders their own thing. And we actually know from the research that that bonds people less than communal meals, which are more popular in the East, where everybody is eating from the same big plates, serving themselves onto the smaller plate, etc. The circular table maybe even rotates. Those actually bond people together. So the question becomes, how do we reproduce that in a virtual environment? And I found several companies that have done that. They've either done it because they're actually taking the time to coordinate delivery of the same food virtually, which is logistically a little difficult when you're managing an international team, but when you're managing a team that was working together in the office and now all lives in roughly the same area, but just isn't going to the office, it's a little bit easier. Other teams that are fully geographically dispersed will pick a genre or a cuisine of food. So they'll say something like, okay, well, today we're going to have South American food. We're going to have Mexican food, for example, and everybody goes and gets something in that genre, comes back on the call. And I recommend you only do this like once a month, because it's possible to do this too often. But everybody comes back, explains what they chose and why, and then we have a group break, a non-work time together, talking about non-work issues and bonding in together. And shared meals really build that sense of bond and identity. And the last piece that I think is perhaps the most important for a virtual team, because it's the one that you'll do most often, is rituals. Rituals are any of those little activities that your team does that other teams do not do. They're inside jokes. They're things that other teams understand that maybe most of the organization doesn't understand. Just little stuff that can build a sense of community, because everybody understands the symbolism behind what's going on. Rituals can be symbols, rituals can be actions. I'll give you a quick example of rituals for a virtual team. I was working with a team a couple of months ago, and I was talking to them, and I noticed a couple people were, instead of using any sort of applause button or typing in the comments, a couple people were on the screen doing this, which is the silent applause from the deaf community, or jazz hands, we collectively call it over here in the United States. They were collectively doing this, and I said, what's the deal with that? What's up with the hands? And they told me, no, that's how we signal to someone on the team that you have a great point and that we really agree, is that little flickering motion of the hands, which I think is brilliant, right? Because it's easier to see on a video call. But it's also a community thing that team has developed as their way of showing agreement. And that ritual build a sense of bonding as well. So fika, meaning taking time one-on-one between members of your team, shared meals, which is taking time together as the whole team, and then thinking about what rituals we create, whether that's rituals of how we give each other feedback, like the jazz hands, or whether that's rituals of how we sign off or what we say to each other in the morning, whatever it is. All of those little rituals really help build that sense of team identity. The last element of a thriving team culture, as we said, is psychological safety. And this, by the way, this is the element of a thriving team culture, virtual or remote. So psychological safety is the extent to which team members feel safe to express themselves and take risks. And what I mean by that is, do people feel like they're willing to put themselves out there, is when they're willing to speak up on a video call and actually say something that corrects the boss maybe? Or are they willing to take the divergent viewpoint? Are they willing to even just take initiative on a project? All of that stems from a sense of whether or not they feel psychologically safe to do so, whether or not they feel safe that they will be not necessarily rewarded for being divergent or for speaking their mind and taking risks, but at the very least won't be punished. That even if they fail, we'll take the learning lessons from that failure and we'll move it forward. So psychological safety speaks to all of that. And if you don't have that sense of psychological safety, even in a co-located team, you're going to get people who are not bringing their full knowledge, skills, and abilities to work, because they're going to be censoring themselves. They're going to be holding back out of fear. And we don't want that. Leaders create a sense of psychological safety, or as the writer Simon Sinek says, right, leaders eat last, because they want to send the message that your safety and you getting what you need makes the biggest difference in whether or not we come out as a team. So how do you build psychological safety? Well, when we look at the research on psychological safety, we notice that it's really built on two different things. Psychological safety is a sense of mutual trust and respect. And as I said, those are two different things. Trust is whether or not I feel safe to speak up and tell you a secret, whether or not I feel safe to disclose myself to you. Trust is whether or not I trust the leader will value the opinion when I share it. Respect is what happens after I share it. Do I feel like I was actually heard, or was I put down too quickly and, oh, that'll never work here? So trust is what happens to create the climate that makes me speak up, that helps me speak up. And respect is what happens after I speak up to create the climate that my voice was accepted and my voice is valuable. And if you haven't guessed, these are two different things, but they are cyclical, right? Because if I am disrespectful when someone speaks up, that person will feel less trusted over time, and it's cyclical. As a leader, the thing we need to be looking at to building a sense of psychological safety, I look at it as two different questions. When you're holding your meetings, when you're holding your one-on-ones with individual employees, two different questions for you. The first is, what do I say? In other words, what do I tell my people to give them a sense that they can trust me? Do I encourage people to take risks with the outright? Do I celebrate people who are currently taking risks to send that message? When I give feedback, do I mention how important it is that they took that risk, and that it may not have worked out? I'm about to give you constructive criticism, but I value that you actually did it. And respect is, how do I say it? It's the tone of voice. It's the words that I use. I come from the part of the United States that has a very dry, sarcastic sense of humor. And then I moved to a different part of the United States that is a much more sort of warm and inviting collegial culture. It didn't go over well for a long time. And I had to learn that a lot of how I was saying things, same message, but just the tone of voice that I was saying it in, was communicating a sense of disrespect that was not my intention at all. Had it not been for my wife, I probably never would have survived. I probably would have been driven out of the South and back to the Northeast of the United States. Now, the place where this sense of psychological safety is built the most is in your weekly meetings or your regularly scheduled team meetings, the video chat meetings where everyone's discussing, and where it's hardest to know whether or not you said something that's disrespectful, whether or not you said something that communicates a lack of trust. So my advice to every single leader here is that when it comes time to be hosting your own meetings, to be hosting your virtual meetings with your teams, appoint someone else to be the monitor. And what I mean by monitor is their job is to watch you. You're running the meeting, but you can't possibly keep track of the comments thread, what your slides are doing, making sure you're looking at the camera so it looks like you're making eye contact. You can't possibly keep track of all of that, and then also watch every little individual face on the screen. So ask for some help from other people on your team to watch what you say and then see the team's reaction. And if you do that, if you watch what you say and then you see the team's reaction, what you'll end up doing is noticing a couple times where you said something that didn't go over as well as you thought, right? That might have communicated a sense of disrespect. You might have been joking, you might have been jovial, but other people took it a little bit differently. In an in-person environment, it would be very easy for you to read the room and notice that. In a virtual environment, it's a lot harder. And you may be accidentally undermining the sense of psychological safety. So appoint a person who can watch for that and meet with you afterwards to give you feedback. And gradually, you'll be building better meetings that create that sense of psychological safety. And once people feel that you, as the leader, are committed to interacting with your colleagues with trust and respect, they themselves will realize that they have no other option than to communicate with trust and respect. So at this point, I've given you a lot of different materials. And as we close and come to question and answer, and I already see a ton of them, keep those questions and comments coming, by the way. As we close and we go to that, I want to give you one big tip. I've given you a lot of different little tips, from fika to office hours to developing rituals, but I'll give you one big tip. This is, if you do nothing else, this is the thing you should be doing in the next week with your team. I call it the where do I start? So where do I start? Well, the first thing you should do is start with what I call a team working agreement, or a social contract, if you will, or sometimes I call it a declaration of interdependence. But what a team working agreement is let's pull everybody together and let's have a conversation about how we're going to work together in this new future. A lot of teams never took the time to discuss little things like what topics and what requests are more appropriate for email, and what need to go into our project management software, if we use one, and what things need to be discussed on a live call, a synchronous call, whether that's a telephone call or a video call or a meeting. A team working agreement means let's answer the questions around how do we want to make requests for help? How do we want to give people feedback? A team working agreement is how are we going to keep each other updated, right? So that everybody knows what everybody's doing, so that the team is what I often call working out loud, so that it's not just a matter of the manager having to keep track of 12 individual relationships and 12 individual status updates every day and then broadcasting that out to the team. How are we going to do that as a team? You come up with that, whatever questions you have for how to keep your team in sync. They vary by the individual team, but you ask them, you get them all out on the table and you compile a document together that says that says we agree, for example, that we agree to wait 24 hours for an email response before we pick up the phone and call someone. Or we agree that if a response is needed faster than that, we don't use email for that technology. What that creates is a sense of norms and a sense of I know how to collaborate now, that will build a sense of shared understanding, a sense of shared identity, and over time, a sense of psychological safety. So build that team working agreement with your team. How are we going to work together now and in the future? Because the future is working partially remote. The future is working from anywhere. And we won't be able to rely on those little cues we get, those little nonverbal things we get in person to coordinate our activities. We're going to have to be more deliberate about it. And a team working agreement speaks to that. So build a sense of shared understanding, shared identity, and psychological safety on your team. There's a variety of little things you can do to do that. But the biggest thing is to start from this team working agreement. If you do that, your team will be better prepared to work from anywhere, and you will be better prepared to lead them from wherever you are. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for listening to me. I know we've got a ton of different questions. I'm excited to get into them.
Thank you so much, David. It's a very interesting perspective on leading from anywhere. I think, we've seen in the last few months a lot of copy paste adaptations of what, we were doing offline. We're just blindly copying it in an online environment. But what you've shown us today, what you have shared with us are some very relatable ideas which talk to the context that we're operating in. So I think very, very interesting. So I'm gonna pick one that really struck with me, which is the rituals. I think so. Yeah, thank you so much, David, for that very insightful and thoughtful ideas that you've shared with all of us. I'm sure everybody loved it. Going by the questions that I have here, I think the audience are absolutely engaged and they're liking what they're hearing. So before I get into audience question, David, a simple question I ask everyone who's worked with leaders across, and you are, you've worked with a lot of leaders. You yourself are a thought leader, right? A very simple question is, what is leadership according to you?
So I'm an academic, right? And so we debate this question all of the time. And if you ask 10 academics for a definition of leadership, you'll get 11 different definitions because somebody will bring footnotes. There's two that I settle on that I really like. The first is from the management theorist Jim Collins, good to great, built to last, etc. And he always says that leadership is the art of getting people to do what needs to be done, right? Not what they don't want to do or want to do, but just so you have to have the skill to see what needs to be done and then the persuasive ability to get people to want to do it. I usually use a slightly different definition because I think what's lacking in Jim's definition is a sense of responsibility. And so I usually use the definition that leadership is the ability to influence people to work toward a mutually desired objective. And I think that last part is key and is missing for a lot of people. There's a lot of great stories of leaders and highly influential people who ended up destroying their company because they weren't thinking about what the mutually desired objective was. They were just thinking about their objective, right? So I usually go with that one, the ability to influence people to work towards a mutually desired objective.
Super. Thanks, David. I think I'm going to pick that, the second question that I have on the board, which relates to what you just said. And that's a question from Rajan Nanda. Rajan, thanks for asking that question. David, you made an interesting reference to BC, before Corona and after Corona. So the question Rajan has is that as a result of this pandemic, what skills have become more important, or what new skills leaders need to learn in PC post-corona era?
I love it. So I'll give you two. I'll give you the individual and I'll give you a leadership, right? The first skill, everyone, regardless of what level of leadership you're at, or if you're even not at a level of leadership, needs to learn is the skill of drawing boundaries. When we had a place to go, when work was a place and not an activity, we had a ritual, if you will, of commuting to it and commuting back from it that created a sense of boundaries. It's why we use the term work-life balance a lot of times, because we have this definitive moment where I'm transitioning from one to the other. And a lot of the cause of our stress over the last 9 months has been the inability to draw those same boundaries in our work and our life. And there are certainly circumstances. If BC is before Corona and PC is post-Corona, we'll call this IC, in Corona. There are certainly things that, whether it's children's schooling needs or caretaking, that are limiting our abilities to draw those boundaries. But now's a good time to practice, so we get into that post-Corona world, we'll be better off drawing those boundaries. For leaders, the biggest skill I think you can develop is the skill of empathetic listening. Listening to understand not just the information, but the emotions behind it. You were given, when you were leading in a face-to-face environment, a lot more nonverbal cues for how your people were feeling than you'll be given even in a video call. And so being able to listen, lean in for that, to listen behind that, maybe even ask questions to check in, like, it sounds like you're really stressed about this, right? Just so that you can help people label their emotion to get you better at reading what the emotion behind what they're saying is. That'll go a long way into helping them, helping you become a more empathetic listener. Speaking of this post-Corona world we're in, did you notice this great sunrise that just popped up because it's early morning hours here and late night hours where you are? This is something that's going to be much more common in a post-Corona world as well. Everybody in different time zones. So love it. Love it.
Yeah, I just noticed that, David, and it looks so nice. Till the time I said you were possibly you've turned on a different light, but that was just lovely to see.
No, it was pitch dark when I started broadcasting with you all, and now the sun is just barely creeping up.
Wow, that's superb. Thank you so much, David. It's never an easy ask to do this early in the morning. Okay, so I think there's an interesting one from Manish. David, Manish's point is that we are hearing many people talk about working from home, and working from anywhere becoming a reality, and we've seen a lot of big tech companies actually making the decision and going out, making statements about working from home and allowing people to work from anywhere. How do you see the situation for more traditional companies? How do you think they would be able to respond to this situation?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of companies are hesitant to make any sort of declarations. With respect to the world of tech companies, I think they are masters at making bold predictions and ending up wrong. Right? There's a lot of tech companies that were supposed to be the future and fail, but so they're used to that. And I think a lot of other companies, especially in more conservative industries, banking, financial services is a great one. They don't want to make predictions about how things are going to go because everybody is still trying to figure out how things are going to go. Nobody really knows what the future holds. So here's what I think will happen. Right now, even the more traditional companies are trying to limit the number of people that are working in office, if anyone's there at all, right? They're limiting it to the essential workers, the people who could not do it anywhere else, right? And then when, let's say, vaccines roll out and it's safe for most people to come back to the office, those are still going to roll out over a number of months. And so who feels comfortable coming back to the office is going to depend on those logistics. Then it's probably going to depend on age and caretaking. If you are working and you're also taking care of elderly parents, you are not going to want to be in that office environment where you could be potentially spreading it back to them. So those are all considerations that companies are going to struggle with over for most of 2021. And so I think it's wise to not actually set a dedicated policy yet. What I can say definitively is that when we get to the end of this, whether that's the end of 2021, early 2022, most companies will have a much more flexible work arrangement than they did in 2019. Not only because they just never transitioned back to it, but because the realization came that not everybody wants to be here all of the time. And so I'm actually a bit more encouraged by some of those traditional companies because they're saying, well, we can't possibly know what the situation is like. I'm encouraged because I hope that means an openness. But I guarantee you, whether you're open to the idea of continuing to work from anywhere or not, I guarantee you your top talent and probably the majority of your talent will not want to come back to the old environment. There's a reason that television shows like The Office and movies like Office Space and cartoons like Dilbert became internationally popular in how they commiserated about the office environment. People aren't going back to that, at least not all of the time. And so the traditional companies that are, it's okay if you're taking your time and not outlining the policy yet, but wherever you are needs to be a position of openness to let's see where this goes and let's optimize for flexibility as opposed to optimize for speed to get everybody back.
Great. David, this next question from Poonam, I think in most measures your session has already answered this question, but I'm still going to ask to see if you have any additional comments to make on this one. So Poonam wants to know that how should leaders equip their employees in remote working to ensure that productivity and motivation remain high when they're not working in physical spaces? So, what strikes me from this question, David, is my own experience, right? When you are working in a physical space, you've got your teams and the whole office is there. And if you want to recognize somebody, you can just sort of get everybody's attention and call that name, call that person out, and everybody joins you in congratulating this colleague, which is very spontaneous and very uplifting. You can't do that in a virtual world. You have to organize meetings to recognize everybody. So I think, yeah, maybe that's an interesting one to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I think you can, you just have to plan for it a bit more, right? So it used to be that you become aware of that thing and then you call them out and praise them about it. And now I think if you're not already doing this is something I encouraged a lot of leaders to do even before Corona. Keep a folder in your email inbox. You know how you can create subfolders called win, right? Or called winning or whatever you want to call it. But the idea is when you get a positive note from a colleague about your team, or you get a positive message from a customer about how well somebody on your team did, any sort of positive feedback, capture it by dragging it into that folder. And then when you start a meeting, go through that folder and pick somebody. And it may be a week or two old, but that's not too old. Nobody doesn't mind being praised, even if it's something they did a week or two ago. So I think you have to be a bit more deliberate about it in that regard, but I think you can do it. The other thing I would say around motivation is that when we were all together and we could utilize tools like that to keep motivated, you notice that a lot of the project deadlines, performance evaluations, et cetera, were at time intervals that were actually quite ridiculous. I mean, I've been speaking out against the tyranny of an annual performance review as opposed to regular ongoing feedback for a number of years. And in a virtual world, that's even more important. The best teams that I see are teams that are actually taking, hey, what is our quarterly objective? And then breaking it into almost weekly or every other week objectives. Here's what we're working on for the next 2 weeks. That makes it easier to track progress. And we know from a lot of research that progress is a powerful, powerful motivator for most people. So whatever you can do to break up and create those small wins along the way towards that larger goal is going to help with motivation as well. That's less of a how do we do what we used to do in person virtually, and more of a because we're virtual, we need to be shrinking those timelines and showing progress much more often.
Interesting idea again, David. I'm sure your book would carry a lot more. So, and I'm assuming that. So you want to talk about that to our audience a bit?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So the new book is called Leading from Anywhere. That's the future we're in. You can actually see it right there a little bit. I believe we're working with our UK European publisher to get it available in India in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's already available in North America now. And really the goal is to speak to exactly the type of manager that is on this webinar. Not the, I want to run my whole company this way, but we're a traditional company. We had remote work forced upon us. How do we survive? What do we do? It's the survival guide to leading virtual teams. And we cover everything from how do you bring that team together and build culture, which is what we talked about today. How do you hire remotely? I think most managers have yet to come to terms with the fact that they're about to be hiring new people for the team that they've never actually met in person or won't meet for 6 months after they actually bring them on. That takes a whole different skill set. How do you keep the team working out loud? How do you manage performance objectives? How do you give feedback? All of that is covered in the book. We structured it sort of around the life cycle of a team, from coming together to even at the very end where you have to disband and maybe work on other projects. The idea being you pick your dilemma, whatever you're struggling with on your team right now, we've got a chapter for it. And so we started, I actually started to write, I wrote the entire book in about 8 weeks. We tried to get it out there as quickly as possible when it became obvious that we were not going all back to the office a couple weeks after the Corona scare, that this was going to be a part of our future for a long time.
Awesome. Wish you all the best for that, David. And I hope the book is available in India soon.
Yeah,
a lot of people are...
you and me both. No,
Yeah.
our timelines are pretty good. We were working with the UK European publisher, and they're about a month behind us timeline wise. So it should be about 2 to 3 weeks now.
Okay, superb. I'll go to the next question from Satish. It's another interesting question and reminds me of one of the sessions that we had earlier on with Neven Postma on organizational politics. Satish wants to know what about dealing with office politics in the current situation? I think it's more on a positive note. So how do you stay visible and drive perceptions in your favor when you're not working in office and working from anywhere?
Yeah. So ideally, you're working with a leader who understands that presence doesn't equal productivity and responsiveness doesn't equal productivity, that productivity equals productivity. But a lot of leaders are not. A lot of leaders relied on that management by walking around idea. Office politics was a matter of how often you were engaging them in conversations, like you said, staying visible. And there's not really a virtual equivalent to that. The irony is the more time you're on these Zoom calls with people, the less time you're actually working. And so what needs to be visible moving forward is what you're getting done. If your leader's not already doing it, check in with them at least every week. For some people, if you need to really move perceptions back to you being the valuable employee, this might be every day, but at least every week, make sure you're sending them an email or scheduling time to talk to them about what did I work on this week? What's my plan for next week? What were my wins and where do I need help? And that way, if you're the only one on your team doing that, it will not take very long before they start to see you as one of the most productive A players on the team, probably because you are one of the more productive A players on the team. But that's what I would be focused on, is what system works best for my manager to keep him or her updated on what did I work on this last week? What am I working on next week? What are my wins and where do I need help? And if you do that, you'll have that very similar to sort of what we'd call schmoozing the boss. I think that's the virtual equivalent to it, because that's the information the boss needs. And if you're the one being forthright giving it to him or her, you will come off as much more productive than I think a lot of people who are just waiting to be asked instead of being proactive about it.
Great. Okay, so David, you also do a lot of work in the area of innovation along with leadership, right? So Mudit has a question that how can companies establish a culture of idea generation or innovation in a remote environment? And do you see any examples emerging from your experience recently?
Yeah, so this is a really difficult one, right? I think for a lot of types of meetings that we would have, virtual tools have almost replaced in-person presence, right? We're not totally there on average meetings, but admitted, it's mind-boggling that we can have 100-person video call with very little lag in 2021. That's mind-blowing. But the tools for idea generation are not as great, right? And this is what I think lends itself to a work from anywhere world versus a fully remote world. If you were attempting to do idea generation and innovation in an in-person setting, a lot of companies that didn't have a strong culture of it thought that meant calling a meeting and brainstorming, meaning spitting out ideas, having somebody with a whiteboard marker capture them all, and then we'll pick one and we'll call that the idea that we came up with. That didn't really work, right? Cultures of innovation understood that it was actually a process, that there was a process of doing research, that there was a process of coming up with the right question, a process of idea generation, a process of testing where different teams would actually test out different solutions that came up in that idea generation. And when you think about it as that process, remote can be beneficial here because it's not one meeting at this point. It's multiple meetings, right? It's a meeting to talk about the research behind the problem and come up with the perfect question. And then maybe it's a meeting to come up with the ideas. And then maybe it's a meeting to come up with the decisions around what are we going to test, right? So that speaks to that process element. On the culture element, the psychological safety piece becomes even more important here. I think there's a lot of companies that unfortunately move to we want to make sure our people are being productive, so how can we spy on them, right? And how can we monitor what they're working on, or how can we get regular reports from it? Things that actually eroded that sense of trust and autonomy that we know is crucial to having individuals express their creativity. So on the culture side, I would say that pay attention to those psychological safety words that we had earlier, and the ways that we can build psychological safety over time and giving people autonomy. On the process side, I would be thinking about solving a problem with a remote team in 3 different fashions, right? The first is a meeting maybe to make sure that we understand the question. The second is coming up with those different ideas. And the third, and there may be different attendees at each of these meetings, but the third is making the decision about what we're going to test, not what we're going to implement, what we're going to test, because then once we test it, we'll get feedback that contributes to the research that brings us right back to the next one. It's a process, and remote helps with that process better. But if we're just trying to replicate the old school brainstorming meeting virtually, it's not going to go well. Those old meetings didn't go very well to begin with. So the virtual version is not going to go very well either.
Thanks, David, and a shout out to our audience. I'll take a pause to thank our audience for all the questions. We've got another 5 minutes or so to go in this segment. Please keep your questions coming. Who knows who will be the 2 lucky winners? Speaking of culture, David, I'll dive into this question, which I skipped earlier from Sheetal. And Sheetal seems to be somebody who works in HR. She wants to know, organizational policies usually evolve over a period of time in such situation, right? And because the experience is still flowing in. Mm-hmm. So how can HR leaders proactively get a pulse of the situation on the ground and influence decisions which are in favor of employees in the organization?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple different software tools. One of them is actually called Pulse that can be used, 15.5, et cetera, that just take a read on how your people are feeling, how are they doing mental health wise, et cetera. But I'm not sure how valuable that feedback would be for making the decision about who's moving back to co-located and not, et cetera. And so this is where, to the extent that you can, this is where I would really go deep on that team working agreement. And I would train most managers to come up with that. Because if you think about it, if we're trying to figure out what we need to build the right policies and the right flexibility policies, remote work policies, et cetera, for the future, wouldn't it be great to have a document from each of the 15 managers, senior leaders, or each of the 100 mid-level managers that we could look at and go, how are people choosing to work? When we give the team a full say in how they could work best as a team, what are the methods that they're choosing to work? Great, let's build our policy around that. So that would, I think, be a more information-rich way to do it than a lot of those little quick pulse things like 15.5 and what have you. I would say let's actually train our managers on coming up with that team working agreement, and then ask them to submit it to us and see, oh, this is how people prefer to work. What you're going to find is that some people are recreating the 9 to 5, if that was the normal business hours of their job, are recreating that. Other people are much more flexible. They're working for a couple hours, then they're doing kid schooling, then they're going back to work. But you'll get a good read on how these teams prefer to work, and you'll be able to build your policies from there.
Thank you, David. This question I suspected would be asked surely, and I think we had a couple of them here. I think you referred to this in your presentation, that work from anywhere is now turning out to be work from everywhere.
Yeah.
People are complaining about no demarcations between work and personal space. I think you've addressed that in your presentation, but let me just ask you differently. From an employee perspective, what should an employee do to ensure that he or she is able to communicate to the managers, and also maintain managers and at home as well, and maintain a healthy balance between work and personal space?
Yeah. So it's all on the individual level. It's all about boundaries, right? So decide what the hours you're going to work are. They don't have to be the same hours, but get that calendar in stone and hold to it. More importantly, than making sure you're getting enough hours is the idea that you're actually pulling away enough. You know what time every day work is over. And then to the extent that you can build in little after work rituals, for example. So I have a friend who goes through this grand kind of mantra of an after work ritual that is his version of recreating the commute back to, from the office, so that it signals to his brain, work is over at this point. I don't actually do that. Let me see if I have them both with me. I just change devices. So I've learned to have two different devices. This is my work device and this is my home device. It lets me still check social media and watch Netflix and that sort of thing, but there's no work related stuff on it. And so the act of switching that out, putting one back into the charger and taking the other out is my after work ritual that builds that sense of boundaries. And again, I feel like I keep going back to the same thing, but there's a reason I picked it as the number one thing to do. A team working agreement also speaks to this in the sense that a lot of intrusions on work, on home life in this work from anywhere world are accidental, right? If you were to ask, if you were to survey the entire team, including the manager, and you were to say, what are reasonable times of day to be sending emails, or what's a reasonable amount of time to wait for a reply to an email, most people would say, yeah, after hours, we really shouldn't be sending anything. You could still compose things, but it shouldn't be showing up in people's email boxes. And yeah, we should actually wait a day or so before demanding a response. If we wanted a faster response, we should have picked a faster medium. What happens is people don't have that conversation, right? And so we accidentally intrude on each other. We realize that because of our life, maybe we put our children to bed and then we knock out a couple more emails. And what we don't realize is that that's pinging our some people's phones at 9 o'clock at night when they want to be off for the rest of the day. And it's distracting them back into work. So coming up with that working agreement, and again, around what are on hours and what are off hours, will help to solve a lot of that, because a lot of us are all, what's interesting is a lot of us all agree that we're struggling with that same issue. And when you talk about it as a team, a lot of us come up with an agreement around those boundaries and never realize that we were accidentally intruding on other people's lives. So have that conversation, do it yourself. But if you have to, force that conversation with your team. If you're in a leadership role, have that conversation with your team about what things are we going to do to signal to each other that this is off time. What things are we going to do to stay communicated even when we're not in sync, so that we're not intruding on each other. And then you could even share best practices. Like I just shared the 2-device practice for how people can manage that work and life piece. And that'll help a lot. That'll go a long way towards it. But a lot of these intrusions are accidental, and they're because we never really thought or were deliberate about agreeing as a team what we were going to do to build those boundaries. All of us agree we need to have them. We just never had the conversation about what they are.
That's so true that well, that question was anonymous, but Sheena, you've asked a similar question. So I hope you got your answer as well, because I sort of got the two questions to merge. Okay, David, the last question on this segment for today, before we formally thank you. We have a lot of students who tuned in today, who are listening in to you. They are obviously worried about their career, their future, given how things will pan out. It's pretty uncertain. So what key message would you want to give to them in terms of what skills they should be focusing on to be ready for future?
Yeah, well, I think probably the biggest skill, and my friend Cal Newport, the writer Cal Newport, probably came up with this a couple of years ago, and then ended up becoming more true. But it's the skill of recognizing when you're doing shallow work and deep work. Deep work are the things that require focus. They require you to limit distractions. They require long stretches of time, 60 minutes or 90 minutes to work. Shallow work is a thing like replying to email. You could do it from anywhere. It doesn't really require higher levels of thinking. But a lot of us don't actually recognize those two different modes and need to build those two different modes into our calendar. So that would be one, just from a pure individual productivity standpoint. The second thing I would say is, ironically, to double down on your communication skills. That's communication like we're doing right now. That's text communication, written communication. That's audio communication. But if I could pick any of those, it would be writing. We're still at a point where the majority of remote teams coordinate the majority of their information via text. And clear writing is clear thinking. And so to the extent that which you can do that, you can stand out from other applicants for jobs, but you'll also be a better teammate when you're on the job, the better you can communicate. Communication is the lifeblood of any relationship, but it's even more important when we're relying on it to know what our teams are doing, because we can't just walk down the hall and tap them on the shoulder anymore. So deep work and communication would be the two places I would focus.
Awesome, David. Thank you very much for a very insightful perspective that you shared with us. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone who's tuned in, who's listening to our conversation today, has also enjoyed it as much. And we are all waiting for your book to show up in India. And I'm sure there are a lot of nuggets of wisdom there that we can pick up from. So, any last words, David, that you want to say before we sign off?
Yeah, I think there was this tendency in the early days to think about how do we get back to normal, how do we get back to business as usual. And let's be honest, business as usual wasn't that great, right? 2 out of 10 people said they were fully engaged. Most people said meetings were a waste of time. We've got an opportunity to rebuild a lot of things about how we work. It starts from the realization that we're going to be working from anywhere. But let's keep tinkering and let's keep experimenting. There's an opportunity in this crisis as well to build a much more enjoyable experience of work. And work is too central to most people's lives to be a terrible experience. So let's get building that future that we want, not the past we used to have.
Great. There is an opportunity in every adversity, more so in this one. Thank you very much, David, for being with us. We got you on the show early morning. Uh, as I said, I know how difficult it is, but it's been great listening to you, David. Wish you all the best, and wish you all the best for your book as well. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our segment today. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to David. I thoroughly loved the conversation. Some great ideas for us to reflect on. In case you joined in the middle of the session or you had to leave for some reason, don't forget to log in onto any of our social media channels or our website. You will find the recording of this live session over there. So you haven't missed really. You can always go back and tap into one of these sessions that we've had for you. With that, I would also like to thank our community partners at Gully, Paul Reiter, Resultix, and Shulini University for supporting us, for being with us, for helping us drive the message and keeping this segment alive. So thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you soon. Yes, 2 winners. Thank you so much. I don't know, somehow I always forget this. More often than not, I forget. Okay. We have 2 winners. Let me just, I think I had a mental note of that. Yes, so first is Rajan Nanda for asking that before Corona and post Corona question. Congratulations, Rajan. Please send in your email IDs. Don't forget to put your email ID in the comment box so that we can ship the voucher to you. Pronto. Then the next question. This was anonymous, so I think I will have to give it to Mudit for asking the question on creating culture of idea and innovation. Mudit, congratulations. Rajan, congratulations. Please leave your email IDs in the comment box. And thank you very much, guys, once again for joining in. Stay safe and stay healthy.